At exactly 1:47 in the morning, a doorbell camera seamlessly disconnects from its local network. A shattered window, blood on a porch, a footprint left in the dirt. The family calling 911 at 11:56 established the absolute end of the timeline. But the police were missing the beginning and the middle. They were staring at a smart home and treating it like a structure from the 1990s. It would take a massive shift in investigative strategy to realize that the house was not completely blind. It was simply storing its secrets in a vault that the local detectives did not know how to open. The local police were entirely focused on the physical trauma on the porch, unaware that a detailed narrative was silently waiting to be extracted from the invisible network. They secured the physical scene but were entirely missing the digital one. The sheer complexity of the digital footprint and the high-profile nature of the victim rapidly overwhelmed the local resources. The Pima County Sheriff Department, led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, found themselves staring into a technological abyss. They needed federal capabilities. But the reality of modern criminal investigation is far more complex and significantly more terrifying. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was formally brought into the case, bringing with them a completely different approach to digital forensics. The federal agents did not look at the doorbell camera and see a plastic shell. They saw a node in a massive global network. The federal digital forensic team immediately bypassed the dead end of the missing cloud subscription. They knew that technology companies harvest diagnostic data continuously, regardless of user payment tiers. Using advanced federal warrants, they bypassed the consumer-facing application and penetrated deep into the back-end servers of Google, the parent company of the security device. They were not looking for user-saved video. They were hunting for raw, cached diagnostic telemetry. What they found shattered the local police timeline and completely altered the trajectory of the entire investigation. Deep within the hidden architecture of the Google back-end federal technicians successfully recovered a single, highly compressed image frame. The air inside our homes is constantly saturated with invisible data. The timestamp on this hidden piece of data was exactly 2:12 in the morning. This single frame did not show a ghost. It showed the distinct silhouette of a suspected intruder lurking in the deep shadows near the front of the property. This was a monumental paradigm shift. The house was not blind. It had captured its attacker, but it had hidden the evidence deep within corporate servers. The recovery of this image at 2:12 in the morning was a massive breakthrough, but it simultaneously ripped open a terrifying hole in the chronological narrative. We know the victim was dropped off at 9:48 in the evening. We now have an image of a suspect at 2:12 in the morning. This creates a massive 4-hour window of absolute uncertainty. What exactly was the alleged perpetrator doing during that massive gap in time? Local wireless networks, cellular pings, Bluetooth handshakes, medical telemetry. The recovery of the Google back-end data confirmed that the suspect was physically present on the property, but it raised a horrifying question about their methodology. Did they breach the house immediately after the son-in-law left and spend hours inside with the elderly victim? Or did they wait patiently outside in the freezing January darkness, conducting extensive pre-operational surveillance before making their move? The single image from 2:12 in the morning proved the authorities could resurrect dead data but it also proved the attacker was incredibly patient. If you are fascinated by how federal agents rip hidden data from corporate servers to build forensic timeline, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives. The discovery of the 212 image shifted the entire focus of the manhunt. The suspect captured in that single frame was no longer just a phantom. They were a digital entity anchored to a specific geographic coordinate at a specific millisecond in time. The federal technicians painstakingly reconstructed the digital heartbeat of the property, pulling fragments of code from remote servers to build a single terrifying picture. When a person vanishes from the physical world, their digital ghost often remains behind, whispering the exact timeline of their violent removal. The suspect caught in that flash of light was entirely unaware that a corporate diagnostic protocol had silently documented their presence. The absolute terror of that gap between 948 and 212 cannot be overstated. A predator was operating with complete impunity, either watching the house from the perimeter or actively moving through the interior. The digital forensics answered the question of presence, but completely failed to answer the question of duration. The investigation was now a high-stakes technological puzzle. Every byte of hidden data could mean the difference between finding the victim and losing them forever. The digital realm had provided a vital clue, but the physical evidence was waiting. With the federal authorities firmly embedded in the investigation, the strategy shifted from a blind physical search to a highly targeted clinical extraction of evidence. The invisible digital net was being cast incredibly wide, but the physical reality of the blood on the porch demanded immediate forensic attention. Crime scene technicians carefully swabbed the dark red stains left on the cold concrete. The biological material was processed rapidly. This is a story about the terrifying space between those invisible signals. The laboratory results confirmed the absolute worst fears of the family and the investigators. The genetic material extracted from the blood on the front porch belonged definitively to 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. This confirmed that a violent physical altercation had occurred at the threshold of the home. She had not simply wandered off. She had been forcibly and violently removed. As the biological reality of the crime set in a bizarre and modern psychological warfare campaign began to unfold, the family and various media outlets suddenly began receiving a barrage of disturbing communications. Multiple ransom notes were delivered demanding large sums of money in exchange for her safe return. The terrifying twist was the chosen currency. The demands were explicitly made for Bitcoin. This cryptocurrency element added a dense layer of cryptographic anonymity to an already incredibly complex case. Investigators and private security consultants frantically analyzed the digital origins of these messages. It is about a massive 4-hour window of absolute darkness where a heavily planned crime intersected with the relentless, unyielding memory of the modern internet. It quickly became apparent that the high-profile nature of the case had attracted opportunistic scammers. Many of the ransom notes were swiftly categorized as cruel fakes generated by individuals completely unconnected to the actual physical abduction. However, after rigorous linguistic and digital analysis, the family and investigators firmly believed that two specific communications were entirely authentic. These two notes contained details or digital signatures that elevated them above the static noise of the scammers. While the psychological terror of the Bitcoin demands occupied the family, the federal authorities were executing a massive, invisible dragnet over the entire neighborhood. According to a local television affiliate, the federal agents were actively pulling and analyzing historical cell tower pings from the geographic area surrounding the residence. They were not looking for a specific known phone number. They were conducting a complex digital proximity search. The analysts were looking for anomalous cellular devices that were lingering near the property during that critical 4-hour window of darkness. They were searching for a phone that did not belong to a neighbor, a device that the local authorities initially believed they were walking into a completely blind crime scene, was quietly communicating with the towers while the suspects stood in the shadows. The clinical breakdown of this data requires sifting through hundreds of thousands of individual data points, filtering out the routine traffic of a sleeping city to find a single predatory signal. The federal net was tightening with mathematical precision. They had the victim blood. They had authentic cryptocurrency ransom demands. They had an image pulled from a hidden server, and they were actively mapping the invisible cellular traffic of the entire grid. The authorities were methodically building an inescapable digital trap. But while the federal digital investigation was operating with ruthless efficiency, the physical forensic investigation was about to hit a massive and highly controversial roadblock. The foundation of any successful prosecution relies entirely on the absolute integrity of the physical evidence. The chain of custody must be flawless. But a critical discovery inside the house was about to test the competence of the local authorities. They assumed the total absence of physical security footage meant a complete absence of evidence. They were incredibly wrong. Technicians processing the interior of the home found a crucial biological sample. It was not a clean sample. It was a complex genetic mixture containing material from more than one individual. This is exactly the type of highly sensitive evidence that requires the most advanced federal processing capabilities in the country. This mixed biological sample held the absolute key to identifying the alleged attacker who breached the house. The entire trajectory of the physical case hinged on how this specific piece of evidence was handled. The federal agents were actively managing the digital architecture, pulling data from cell towers and Google servers with extreme precision. The logical protocol would dictate handing the complex biological mixture directly to the federal experts where the most advanced processing facilities are located. But the meticulously constructed forensic timeline and the integrity of the physical evidence were about to be severely threatened. The local leadership made an incredibly controversial administrative decision regarding this crucial genetic mixture. In a move that shocked forensic analysts, Sheriff Nanos chose to bypass the federal laboratory entirely. Every smart device in a modern home is constantly talking to the outside world. And when someone attempts to violently, instead of utilizing the federal resources, they opted to package the most critical piece of biological evidence in the entire case and ship it across the country to a private independent laboratory in Florida. This decision immediately injected a massive dose of systemic doubt into the investigation. While the federal agents were successfully hunting digital ghosts, the local police were gambling the physical evidence on a third-party facility. The clinical separation of the digital and physical investigations created a dangerous friction point that could potentially unravel the entire case in a court of law. The strategic pivot regarding the complex genetic material introduced a profound vulnerability into the architecture of the prosecution. When local law enforcement leadership actively chose to bypass the established federal forensic hierarchy, they did not just change a shipping address. They shifted the entire burden of scientific proof onto a commercial entity. The local sheriff faced mounting public scrutiny as news organizations began to question the operational integrity of the department. The genetic mixture recovered from the interior of the residence was not a pristine sample. It does not short circuit. It is intentionally blinded. Silence. That conversation, the resulting silence itself, becomes the most damning piece of evidence imaginable. It was a chaotic, microscopic collision of cellular data belonging to the victim and the unidentified intruder. Extracting a usable profile from this biological static requires an algorithmic precision that federal facilities spend billions to perfect. By diverting this crucial material to a private enterprise, the local command structure essentially placed the ultimate verdict in the hands of a corporate algorithm rather than a federally verified standard. The concept of chain of custody is the absolute bedrock of the American judicial system. It is the unbroken documented trail that proves a piece of evidence has not been altered, contaminated, or substituted from the moment of collection to its presentation in a courtroom. Every single time a swab changes hands, every time it is placed on an airplane or processed through a commercial courier service, the structural integrity of that chain is stretched. The physical distance between the southwestern crime scene and the southeastern laboratory introduced unnecessary logistical variables into an already volatile equation. The investigation into what happened during those early morning hours would push digital forensics to its absolute limits, while federal analysts were mapping the invisible network of local cell towers with clinical accuracy. The physical anchor of the case was traveling across the country outside of direct federal oversight. This stark operational divide highlighted a severe jurisdictional friction. The local authorities were fiercely guarding their autonomy over the physical scene while simultaneously relying on federal agencies to illuminate the digital darkness. This bureaucratic disconnect occurred while the clock was mercilessly ticking against the survival odds of the elderly woman. The public was demanding swift justice, while the internal machinery of the investigation was grinding its gears over laboratory protocols. The media apparatus descended upon the local precinct, dissecting the sheriff and his unconventional evidentiary decisions. Press conferences became hostile arenas where forensic methodology overshadowed the search efforts. The narrative began to fracture. Instead of a unified front against a sophisticated predator, the story morphed into a cautionary tale of systemic ego and procedural gambling. The complex genetic mixture sitting in a private facility became a ticking time bomb, requiring federal law enforcement intervention to dig deep into hidden back-end servers just to find a single frame of truth. If the commercial laboratory failed to isolate a clean profile, or if their proprietary extraction methods were later deemed legally inadmissible, the entire physical foundation of the case would instantly evaporate. The intense media scrutiny focused relentlessly on this specific deviation from standard protocol. News anchors and legal analysts debated the tactical wisdom of the sheriff nightly. The public trust, which is absolutely vital in generating reliable tips and community cooperation, began to rapidly erode. Every single day that passed without a confirmed match from the Florida facility amplified the perception of systemic incompetence. The investigators were caught in a brutal crossfire between public expectation and scientific reality. They needed a definitive physical link to validate the massive electronic net they had cast. The terrifying reality was that the suspect might have left behind just enough biological material to prove someone was there, but not enough to prove exactly who. This legal limbo is the ultimate nightmare for any prosecuting attorney. The forensic timeline we are about to construct is built entirely on the fragile, invisible threads of technology that tie a human life to a server. The suspect was effectively a phantom in both the physical and the digital realms, appearing only in corrupted biological mixtures and hidden corporate code. The pressure cooker environment inside the precinct was palpable. Detectives were exhausted, chasing dead-end leads while waiting desperately for the private laboratory to return a decisive result. Let us know in the comments below if you think local jurisdictions should be legally compelled to use federal resources in capital cases, or if they should retain the autonomy to choose their own forensic partners. As the local precinct battled the press over biological swabs, the federal technicians analyzing the electronic timeline finally aligned the scattered data points, and what they discovered was a masterclass in psychological terror. The true horror of this crime was not found in the chaotic genetic material, but in the sterile mathematical precision of the timeline. For days, investigators had been staring at 3 isolated data points. The security system going dark at 147. Welcome to the dark intersection of violent crime and digital forensics, where the truth is buried in the data. The hidden server image captured at 212. The sudden catastrophic failure of the cardiac monitoring application at 228. Initially, these looked like independent technological failures, but when federal analysts overlaid these digital events onto a single chronological matrix, the terrifying narrative finally crystallized. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a chaotic home invasion that accidentally escalated into an abduction. The massive void of time between the son-in-law leaving at 9:48 and the first technological anomaly at 1:47 was not empty space. It was the crucial phase of pre-operational surveillance. The perpetrator did not just walk up to the property and kick down the door. They waited. They watched from the freezing perimeter, hiding in the blind spots of the neighborhood security grid. They observed the rhythm of the house, waiting for the exact moment the resident entered a deep sleep cycle. The illusion of absolute safety is often built on a foundation of constant surveillance. The methodical nature of the attack is chilling. At 1:47, the intruder initiated the breach by deliberately severing the external security eyes. They understood the architecture of the local network and dismantled it with surgical precision. But the second data point, at 212, the phantom image recovered from the corporate server proved that the attacker was still navigating the exterior 25 minutes later. They were taking their time. They were clearing the perimeter, ensuring no secondary alarms were triggered before breaching the final physical threshold. They were operating with the cold, calculated patience of a seasoned predator. And then came the final devastating data point. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the remote telemetry application designed to monitor a fragile human heart permanently stopped receiving data. The local detectives initially theorized that the attacker might have simply smashed the mobile phone or unplugged the base station during a physical struggle. For 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, that surveillance was not just for security, but federal forensic cardiologists presented a far more sinister reality. The specific error code registered by the application did not indicate a hardware failure on the receiving end. It indicated a sudden, catastrophic loss of the biological signal itself. The medical implant was attempting to transmit critical data, but the environment had violently changed. The connection was not broken by a shattered screen or a severed power cord. It was broken by a sudden, traumatic event that fundamentally disrupted the proximity and physiological function required for the network to operate. 2:28 in the morning was not a glitch. It was the precise digital signature of the violent extraction. It was the exact millisecond the victim was pulled away from the life-saving radius of her internal medical network. This was the moment the physical struggle reached its terrifying conclusion. It was a matter of basic biological survival. The timeline proved that the attacker spent exactly 41 minutes executing the breach from the moment they blinded the exterior of the house to the moment they silenced the internal biological monitor. 41 minutes of calculated, methodical terror. This revelation fundamentally shifted the psychological profile of the suspect. They were highly organized, technologically literate, and entirely devoid of panic. A common burglar would have fled at the first sign of an occupied home. A frantic attacker would have rushed the execution, leaving behind massive amounts of physical disruption. But this individual moved through the darkness with a terrifying confidence, leaving behind a trail of severed electronic connections instead of conventional fingerprints. The gap was finally explained. It was the patient stalking of vulnerable prey, followed by a highly controlled execution. The digital forensics had successfully resurrected the ghost of the crime, mapping the exact trajectory of the violence with objective mathematical certainty. If you find this level of forensic reconstruction as fascinating as it is terrifying, share this. Her daily existence was intimately tied to a network of medical tracking devices. Analysis with someone who needs to understand the true realities of modern digital evidence. The entire sequence of events was now illuminated by the cold, unforgiving light of server logs and medical telemetry. The authorities knew exactly when the perimeter was compromised. They knew exactly how long the attacker lingered in the shadows. And tragically, they knew the exact minute the woman was ripped away from her final line of defense. The technological puzzle was definitively complete, but the physical reality remained agonizingly unresolved. The digital autopsy had been performed flawlessly, laying bare the mechanics of the abduction. But the physical body, the human center of this entire tragedy, was still missing. The sheer volume of intelligence gathered by the federal agencies was unprecedented, but it ultimately collided with a massive physical wall. Knowing the exact sequence of a nightmare does not wake you up from it. She relied heavily on a sophisticated pacemaker that communicated constantly with a mobile application, ensuring her fragile heart rhythm was continuously monitored and logged. The investigation entered a grueling phase of legal maneuvering and psychological warfare. The decision to utilize the commercial laboratory birthed a contentious legal battle before a suspect was even apprehended. Defense attorneys representing potential persons of interest immediately began laying the groundwork to attack the biological findings. They filed preemptive motions questioning the algorithms used to separate the genetic mixture, arguing that the lack of federal oversight rendered the conclusions scientifically unreliable. The physical evidence, which should have been the strongest pillar of the prosecution, was rapidly deteriorating into a complex debate over commercial trade secrets and statistical probability. This legal quagmire paralyzed the forward momentum of the local precinct. While the lawyers argued over algorithmic validity, the family was subjected to a relentless campaign of extortion. The electronic realm, which had provided the timeline, also provided a shield for opportunistic predators. The cryptocurrency demands continued to flood in transforming a missing persons case into a high-stakes financial hostage crisis. The two communications deemed authentic by linguistic experts hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. 41 minutes later at 2:28 in the morning, a pacemaker application on a bedside. This is the anomaly at the center of her life. They demanded untraceable digital currency in exchange for coordinates proving that the architect of this crime understood the modern landscape of anonymity perfectly. The authorities were trapped in a frustrating paradox. They possessed the most advanced forensic timeline ever constructed. They could point to a specific millisecond on a server log and say this is exactly when the crime occurred. They could extract a single frame of a shadow from a hidden corporate vault. But all of this sophisticated technology was entirely useless when it came to answering the single most important question of the entire case. Where is she? The harsh reality of modern law enforcement is that data cannot physically excavate a shallow grave. A proximity search cannot canvass a dense forest or a deep body of water. The electronic footprint ended at the edge of the property line. The moment the suspect loaded the victim into a vehicle and drove beyond the range of the local wireless network, she lived alone, but she was never truly disconnected. They slipped back into the physical world, a world that is vast, silent, and incredibly difficult to search. The cold clinical truth is that technology only records what it is programmed to see. The electronic eyes were blinded, the biological monitor was disconnected, and the trail went completely cold. The family was left entirely suspended in a state of ambiguous loss, a psychological torture where mourning is impossible because the finality of death remains unconfirmed. The case file grew thicker with raw packet captures and network logs, but it remained devoid of a geographic location. The incredible triumph of the federal data recovery was ultimately overshadowed by the profound failure to locate the human being at the center of the incident. The house stands empty, a silent monument to a devastating security breach. The local community, which initially rallied around the search efforts, slowly succumbed to the chilling realization that absolute safety is an illusion. The neighborhood watch groups felt entirely futile in the face of an adversary who could manipulate code and sever biological telemetry. The authorities continued to monitor the wallets associated with the extortion demands waiting for a single transaction that might trigger a trace. Her biological functions were tethered to the cloud. But the wallets remained dormant. The state-of-the-art reconstruction had flawlessly answered the questions of who was there and how they operated. Yet it remained entirely paralyzed by the vast physical geography of the real world. The ultimate tragedy of this highly technical investigation is the stark realization that all the server logs in the world cannot replace the simple human necessity of bringing someone home. What this case teaches us about the fragility of our digital boundaries is profoundly disturbing. From a behavioral psychology perspective, the massive 4-hour void completely separates the opportunistic criminal from the apex predator. An opportunistic thief operates on pure speed, minimizing time on target to rapidly reduce physical exposure and the mathematical chance of capture. The suspect in this specific scenario utilized time as a tactical weapon, engaging in extended pre-operational surveillance to guarantee a completely frictionless extraction. This specific behavioral signature is the absolute hallmark of a highly organized, dangerous offender. Furthermore, this investigation completely shatters the dangerous modern illusion of consumer cybersecurity. This medical device was designed to save her life, but it would ultimately serve an entirely different purpose. The general public assumption that simply failing to pay a cloud storage fee guarantees complete data privacy is entirely and scientifically false. Massive corporate architecture continuously harvests raw diagnostic telemetry regardless of your active subscription status. Deleting an application or physically severing a local network connection does not erase the historical footprint permanently embedded deep within commercial back-end servers. The digital echo is always permanent. On a broader systemic level, this case clearly highlights the severe logistical friction that inevitably occurs when local jurisdictions forcefully collide with advanced federal capabilities. The highly controversial administrative decision to actively bypass the premier federal laboratory in favor of a private commercial facility demonstrates a dangerous lack of national standardization in handling incredibly complex genetic profiles. When the crucial chain of custody is driven by local jurisdictional pride rather than absolute scientific consensus, the fundamental integrity of the entire American judicial process is severely compromised. True forensic success demands seamless interagency cooperation, not toxic bureaucratic division. It would become the silent digital witness to her final known moments. The reliance on third-party corporate algorithms to interpret chaotic biological data introduces an unacceptable level of reasonable doubt into a capital investigation. The most haunting artifact of this entire investigation is not the blood on the concrete or the shadow caught on the corporate server. It is the simple, sterile error message generated by a cardiac monitoring application at exactly 2:28 in the morning. That single line of code represents the exact moment a human life was violently disconnected from the world. The authorities built a flawless timeline, but the final destination remains shrouded in absolute darkness. We are left to confront a terrifying and unresolved anomaly. If this alleged predator was sophisticated enough to systematically blind a security network, navigate a massive digital dragnet, and vanish completely without leaving a conclusive physical trace. We must ask one final question. Are the two authenticated cryptocurrency extortion demands genuine proof of life, or are they simply a brilliant digital smokescreen designed to keep federal agents chasing ghosts on the blockchain while the physical reality decays in silence? On the evening of January 31st, 2026, the physical timeline of the elderly woman appears perfectly routine. The cold hard data tells us exactly how she was taken, but the data absolutely cannot bring her back. Hit subscribe, leave your theories below, and I will see you in the evidence room next time to uncover more truth. At 9:48 in the evening, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her back to her quiet residence. The garage door mechanism engaged. The heavy door slowly closed behind them, shutting out the cold night air. Tommaso ensured she was safely inside before he eventually departed. The engine noise of his vehicle fading into the distance at 9:48 was the last confirmed physical interaction she had with her family. Smartphone registers a sudden and permanent loss of signal from the human heart. It is monitoring. From the outside, the property looked entirely secure. The doors were locked. The perimeter was quiet, but inside the home was quietly counting down the minutes. Nancy prepared for bed, unaware that the invisible digital tether keeping her connected to the outside world was about to be severed. The quiet routine of an elderly woman settling in for the night is a vulnerable transition. The house was equipped with a doorbell camera designed to capture any physical approach to the front entryway. However, the system was only as strong as its active connection. As the hours crept past midnight, the neighborhood remained completely still. Yet beneath that stillness, a terrifying reality was unfolding. The security infrastructure protecting the residents was being methodically evaluated from the outside. These are not mechanical glitches or random connectivity issues. The house was not just a home, it was a carefully chosen target. The digital eyes watching the front porch were about to be forcefully closed. Every single second that ticked by after 9:48 in the evening was a second closer to absolute sensory deprivation for the property. The house stood silently in the dark, surrounded by meticulously manicured lawns and quiet streets. It was a fortress built on a foundation of invisible wireless signals and cellular data streams, simply waiting for a catastrophic breach. The elderly woman slept upstairs while the electronic devices around her stood guard on the main floor. But those modern devices are easily compromised if an unseen predator knows exactly where to look and exactly what connections to sever. The digital pulse of the entire home was incredibly steady. The medical application logged her resting heart rate with clinical precision. The wireless router maintained its constant, unbroken connection to the local broadband network. These are the cold digital signatures of a meticulously executed abduction. Everything was functioning exactly as it was engineered to do. But sophisticated technology cannot actually stop a physical human intrusion. It can only record the exact devastating moment it fails to operate. After the departure of her son-in-law, the house became an isolated island in the dark. It sat there silently, counting down the agonizing minutes until its protective digital eyes would be violently and permanently blinded by an unknown intruder. The first physical indication that the digital tether had been broken came the following morning. Sunday, February 1st, was supposed to be a day of routine spiritual observation for the family. Nancy was scheduled to attend her regular church service. Given her age and frail condition, she typically participated through a live internet stream, joining her congregation from the safety of her living room. But when the service began, the stream registered one less participant. Her absence was immediate and glaring. In a case where human eyes saw absolutely nothing, a hidden digital footprint caught everything. By 11:56 in the morning, the mounting anxiety within her family reached a critical breaking point. Repeated phone calls went unanswered. The silence from the usually responsive 84-year-old was entirely out of character. Recognizing the imminent danger, they immediately contacted local emergency services. They dialed 911, initiating a frantic welfare check that would rapidly escalate into a full-scale criminal investigation. When local law enforcement officers arrived at the property, they were met with a scene that immediately shattered any hope of a simple medical emergency. The front entryway presented a chilling physical narrative. Smeared across the concrete of the front porch was a distinct trail of blood. The dark red stain stood out violently against the otherwise pristine suburban architecture. The house itself was eerily quiet. The forced entry was minimal, but the implications of the blood were catastrophic. Officers secured the perimeter and immediately began searching for the most crucial element of any modern investigation. If you want to see how modern forensic data truly breaks a case wide open, hit subscribe and step back into the Ellis evidence room. They looked for the cameras. They located the doorbell security device mounted near the front door. This piece of hardware should have captured the entire event. It should have recorded the face of the intruder, the method of entry, and the violent struggle that left blood on the pavement. But when detectives requested access to the video footage, they hit a massive evidentiary wall. The family confirmed a devastating oversight. The camera hardware was physically installed, but the victim did not possess an active cloud storage subscription. The local police department made a rapid and seemingly logical deduction based on this information. They concluded that because there was no paid subscription, no video data was ever uploaded to an external server. They believed the hardware was essentially a dummy camera capable of live viewing, but entirely incapable of historical recording. The local investigators assumed they were standing in the middle of a completely blind crime scene. They believed the perpetrator had operated in a total technological vacuum, leaving behind only the physical blood on the concrete and an empty house. We often assume that a crime scene is defined by physical boundaries. The initial hours of the investigation were consumed by this massive sensory deficit. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and desperately searching for any neighbor who might have heard a scream or seen a strange vehicle. They were relying on fragile human memory because they believed the digital memory was completely empty. The police were operating under the fundamental assumption that without a paid service agreement, the internet simply ignores the hardware. They treated the doorbell camera as a useless piece of plastic. This early assumption nearly derailed the entire forensic timeline. The local authorities failed to recognize a fundamental truth about modern digital infrastructure. The internet never truly forgets anything. Data does not simply vanish because a monthly fee goes unpaid. The hardware is designed to constantly handshake with remote servers, pinging its status and caching temporary files deep within the architecture of the web. The blood on the porch proved a violent physical extraction had occurred.